functionally, I think it was I truly think that in some way it was a Trojan horse, not for whites, but for other people. And I know that sounds kind of weird right now, but I think as time plays out, if the West succeeds in what they're doing, I think that it will be proven that
I think you're wrong. I think you're wrong about that.
Okay, tell me why.
I mean, all right, so like my mentality is I think that like the upper class of this country understands like the more people they can get into like the offices and into like, you know, be able to advertise to and be able to like inculcate into what we call white culture, right? It allows them to be able to make more money because like it's just expansion, right? So like, you know, more people in the labor pool equals lower labor cost, right? More people, you know, I mean, you're able to sell to equals a larger market share. Right. And I think that's what most of that shit really was. In the end of the day is getting people to accept like other people who aren't like them. You know what I mean? And that way they can expand their motherfucking shit. That's just all like liberal bullshit at the end of the day.
Oh, I agree with you. I'm just saying, like, I think that was the point. I agree with you. I think that's the point. I think they wanted to get brown people to feel like they're white while saying that they hate whites. It's kind of ironic. It's like, well, whitey's really bad, but I want to be exactly like them. It's like, okay, so.
You brought the Max Weberian Puritan ethic with you, and you successfully brought the Rudyard Kipling taking on the white man's burden, in effect. The Joe Conradian, the horror of white world colonization into transhumanist spirit. Because post-capitalism ultimately means transhumanism, escaping the body to be an individual.
I mean, ultimately, that's what liberalism is like fucking the need to be able to be an individual at like any fucking expense. Like that's where like Voltaire and all this shit started.
And you deny your racial primordial traditions in favor of a universal spirit that is neither male nor female. And it's basically practiced by all the elites.
Yeah, it's liberalism, right? In the end of the day, right? Fucking Voltaire said, listen, I don't want to stand here and like let this earthquake have power and recognize that it's a thing because I don't want the earth to have that much power over me. Because he didn't want to be a fucking human, right? Like the elites always, like since the beginning of liberalism, were basically like the sons and daughters of aristocrats and lords. And they wanted to be able to live in every city the way they lived, you know what I mean? Like in fucking London or Paris, wherever the case was. And so they wanted to be international citizens and not be responsible to their family, their community, or their fucking blood or anything like that. They don't want to be tied to shit. And that's the mentality of liberalism. And that the end result of liberalism is fucking critical race theory and all that fucking bullshit. That's literally what liberalism is.
Janet's being tardy in the chat. She doesn't understand the concept of ownership. Because it's funny, because it's like the analytical ideal. Well, if I own a race, don't I own it? Well, again, if you didn't, you can't own authenticity. This is a Heideggerian concept.
Yo, Hank, dude, you're the most liberal person on the planet, bro. Like, you're not allowed to agree with me.
Are you aware of a Yuri Bezmenov from the 80s?
Yep.
Yeah. Everybody is aware of his interview that he gave.
Yeah, so you know how he came over and he kind of like spilled the beans on what the KGB was doing with critical theory, you know, sort of infiltrating the institutions and the media and then, you know, bankrupting and sort of to head towards a coup, you know, that type of stuff. So, I mean, how do you sort of, I don't know, come to terms with something like that? Do you think it's justified or something?
Do you know what chaos theory is?
I think psychological warfare is real. It's just happening on both sides.
Yo, it's not even that,
sure,
right?
Sure.
Like, think about it like this. If you see somebody's weakness, right, and like they're heading towards a direction, you know what I mean, and you want them to keep heading in that direction, you don't really have to stand here, you know what I mean, and like fucking like convince them to go in that direction. They're already going that way. You just keep, you know what I mean, nudging them little by little to keep going in that direction that they're already going. That's what that is.
Would you consider, would you consider yourself a communist or what, a socialist?
No, I'm a communitarian, right?
I'm talking about.
I would say communism is a state of mind. It's not a political party. It was an ideal developed by Marx, which is envisioned by Hegelism, which basically is the end result of a enforced liberal society.
Right. You know, I think it's like an idealistic, almost a religious ideology, you know, to uproot and supplement other, you know, ideas.
communism naturally would come with National Socialism.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's like the same thing, just slightly shifted.
Well,
You know?
well, and Pilliter makes a good distinction, which is that the neo-Trotskyists basically take National Socialism and say, well, we need international socialism, which never ends and basically runs humanity off a cliff into
Do you distinguish, like, like good capitalism from like globalist capitalism? Do you make that distinction, or do you just sort of lump them in together? Like a good capitalism, I'll give you an example, is just like a man and being able to support his family by having his own business, or something like that. Whereas opposed to like a corporation that monopolizes and pushes towards like a one world whatever system. You know what I mean? I think there is a difference between that.
Well, I remember Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations, and he accidentally discovered capitalism. He just said that, well, if you make more wealth than a commodity that you provide, there could be an individualized revolution in the economy. The elites came onto it, and that was the invention of capitalism. It's when profits are in command. What happened on a full scale was that history made corporations and institutions based solely upon that profit incentive, and it no longer became a virtue. Right. There is no virtue selling a commodity.
It's all about progress and sort of comfort, and idealism. I agree. Absolutely. Because at one time it seemed that governments were sort of the reason they were there was to promote the good and justice. You know what I mean? It had nothing to do with like a sort of utopia or whatever. But I think there's two extremes there on kind of both sides of the left and the right. There is a middle path if we could get to that. I think like a mean between the extremes. But I don't know what that would look like.
But here's the thing. Remember, it's not about the money. It's about the message. So in Max Weberian ideals of economy, capitalism only came about because of certain Puritan ethics that was later enforced. Now, if you have more an Eastern ideal of the world, capitalism starts to fade away because the economy and what society wants is no longer planned by individuals, and you can't have capitalism anymore. And so what that entails ultimately is that it really goes back to evolutionary psychology and the ideal of who's interesting and what people want, right? The gamble right now is that the state thinks that they can create automated machines where people can just stay at home and press buttons and Zoom, and they're betting on that. Now, that doesn't mean Jews have went away from the equation. Jews have successfully infiltrated the heroic tendencies of socialism by saying ideals of Trotskyism, where they implant Judaism to the ideal that only first world countries exist, everybody's third world is problematic and anti-Semitic, and everything is based upon mass communications and psychological warfare. That just continued on. And
you look at the recent talk by NVIDIA, I mean, they basically want to put a robot as your keeper, you know what I'm saying, in every home, basically. So, yeah, it's getting pretty close to that, I would say.
Well, I have a question. I have a question, Pilliter. Radless, I have a question for you. I've been thinking a lot about this like the past couple of months, right? I feel like this is like actually like colonialism, right? But not like the whole like mentality of like what the fucking leftists say, but it's actually like literally the Jews are always, when they leave like the Middle East and leave their homeland, they're always like colonists elsewhere, right? And like the English, when they came to America, were colonists, and they had to conquer a nation. And the best way to like conquer a nation was to give individuals the ability to like profit from like their shit, right? To profit from what they're doing. I think maybe, right? Like this is a colonial ideology of capitalism. Right, where it's like there's no family, there's no community, there's no long-term shit. You know what I mean? You're not worried about what's going to happen to your kids. You know what I mean? All these type of things, right?
Well, like certainly it's colonial in the sense that it's evangelical, right? It needs to be spread across the world because this idea of international socialism needs to have its counterpart with this idea of international capitalism. And most of the crusades that the West has waged over the past 2 centuries has basically just been about forcing the third world, forcing the global South into the market economy.
Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, as Lenin has stated, because once you have unnecessary wars, it's all driven by profit. There's no longer somebody in command about virtue. And this is what libertarians don't understand. And this explains why we have the Warwick School, why we have Nick Land and Roger Zelazny and accelerationists, is that you are no longer in control of what makes profit. It is now a sentient being that goes beyond of what it's doing. And that's how you explain imperialism.
Well, it's legalism in the end of the day, right? It's all this like legal bullshit that we set up to be able to continue to, you know what I'm saying, like run this fucking system. And it's all ran by bureaucrats. That's what the socialist aspect of it is. Like socialism, you might as well just say like bureaucracy. You know what I mean? Like that's all that shit is in the end of the day. And that's why I like to control the food supply. They make sure the food's fucking affordable for everybody. They make sure that like, you know, everything keeps running the same way as it's always been running because it keeps them in power.
And they can fix the housing prices, gas prices, and whatever resources they're using. And what that entails is that it's not about the money, it's about the message. It's about keeping in a pseudo-Hinduism class of people, and money is not real. There's no such thing as money. It's just a credit leverage system, and everybody's in debt, and it's based upon usury.
Sure.
Yeah,
Jenna, what's the answer to that? I mean, you know, we've seen sort of what Stalin did, or you know, what the Soviets did, where they sort of took, you know, all that away, and look at how many deaths happened, you know, because of that. It's like the ideology that supplants it looks good on paper, but in practice, it's not great, you know. And I'm not saying that capitalism is great either, but I don't know, as compared to like a communist dictatorship or something, I think it's a little better.
Well, I agree with Solzhenitsyn that Solzhenitsyn is right to point out that most of Soviet Russia was living under some kind of fantasy post-Stalin. Many people did. And starting with Khrushchev during the revisionist period, that's when the Trotskyism came in the liberalization. And during this, the whole point of such, you know, aside from G7 celebrating Solzhenitsyn, the whole point is that there's just something about the state shaking hands post-Cold War to convolute and to get a giant kind of oligarchy going on, which, I mean, this seems like it's Alex Jones territory, but it is. And I think this is where, you know, the old world gets conflated with the new, and really it's all the same thing. And that's what Solzhenitsyn is pointing out.
Yo, Jenna asked a really good question in the chat. She said, would liberals not cut their dicks off like trans people, or is a liberal ideology of ownership which leads them to cut their dicks off? Yo, listen, again.
And cut their dicks off.
Yeah, listen, the reason why that's a thing is because, like, what is the best office worker you could imagine? Right? It's somebody who like will never cause you a sexual harassment case, who doesn't have real relationships, who doesn't have like any actual like hormones or like any place they come from. It's an androgynous like fucking blob that's going to require insurance forever. So they're going to keep that fucking job and do whatever they can to keep that job. Right? So like that's why you would have that. It is the ideal cubicle dweller. Right. And what is, you know, I mean, a liberal is somebody who like is a cosmopolitan city dweller who just, you know, I mean, can live in every city the same way like that they live in like any city. Right. That's literally, it's literally like these people fit in the boxes. Right. And they'll fit themselves like they want that box to fit them and they want them to fit that box. So like they literally have like their same shit. That's why like you see like all them Black Lives Matter posters everywhere, all that type of shit. It's literally like saying, hey, listen, I'm part of your class. Right? I'm part of this, right? And you're part of this. And we all match and we all had the same ideology. And it's literally just about making the systems continue forward in the end of the day, especially on a lower level, because all they want is to continue to have like this system like continue, because they're the bureaucrats who run this system, especially the lower level ones.
You could almost argue that a lot of it is almost, there's this idea that everybody, in spite of their individualism, right? Everybody finally, nobody's a complete individualist and everybody is desperate to belong to something. So liberalism and leftism are essentially that, right? They're essentially ersatz groups that you could affiliate yourself with when you no longer have any like actual meaningful group left. It's a form of group identity that you can use to virtue signal.
That's why white is
isn't
such a
that
trash
what-
thing.
Right. Critical theory is sort of about is moving people into these certain groups to pit them against each other, and
It's not, bro. It's really not.
Well, here's two things. One, for the trans people and for cutting your dick off, a part of liberalism ultimately is Malthusianism. It's about depopulation, degrowthing, and making sure that there's only one stagnant elite group. It doesn't build bridges. It doesn't build spaceships. It just exists as everything decays apart. Huxley wrote this in Brave New World. Basically, all the elites have everything they do and will tomorrow. There is no growth. It's just hand-me-downs constantly. So staying in the pods and eating bugs is just like what Jean Baudrillard said about the McDonald's cheeseburger. It's not real. It's made of slurry, but it looks like a cheeseburger. And you eat it, and you believe it's a cheeseburger, but it's made of blood because it's the cheapest possible materials to make it from. But you're being gaslighted into thinking it's high quality. And the real truth of the matter is, it's just that it's a failing economy because there's too many people to satisfy at one given time. So Malthusianism has to celebrate a few selected group of people at the expense. You have a giant pyramid scheme going on. And that's exactly what the whole G7 global control is about. It's about keeping a Malthusian state for a few and destroying the rest of the world until the endless winter of Rugenach.
Yeah, and Jenna, isn't patriotism liberal then? Ultimately, nationalism is 100% liberal, right? Because like nationalism is actually a really, really new thing. If you go back and look at places like Italy or France or like Switzerland or Germany before, like the 1850s, most of these people didn't even speak the same fucking languages. Right?
Yeah, it's more like tribalism, and I think that's the thing is nation meant like tribe more than it meant state, or something before. Yeah,
like literally, like you as like a member of your community, you wouldn't have never been to the city. You wouldn't even speak the same language as somebody from Paris, or like if you lived in like southern Italy, you wouldn't speak the same language as somebody from Rome. You would barely be able to like understand each other. And it's only with like schooling and modern communication that you have like the modern idea of like nationalism or patriotism, that you think of today comes out of.
Well, when they first introduced nationwide conscription in these various countries during the 18th and 19th centuries, everybody hated it. The peasants would literally, the conscription officers would come in and they'd be telling you, oh, you owe this to the king and you owe this to your nation, and they wouldn't make it out alive because that was like this idea that like an ordinary working class person felt any solidarity to some faraway elite somewhere in Paris or Rome would have been seen as just absurd.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what I was saying 30 minutes ago. That's the problem with white nationalism because it relies on, like I said, a vague sense of belonging, which is just a form of liberalism in the context of modernity. And you might as well say Asian people are white.
True. Right. And literally, like, the whole concept of white really comes out of like the immigrant communities that were leaving the cities back in, the 1890s to the 1950s, when we started putting in like this civic engineering or the civil engineering in cities, and we moved like Southern blacks in to break like ethnic enclaves because they wanted to have like the unions get broken to have lower wages. Right. This is like pushed by people like the Ford Foundation and like JP Morgan, these type of guys. Right. And as these motherfuckers like sat here and like they broke those ethnic communities, they left and they just became white instead of being Polish or Italian or Irish or whatever the case was. That's where white comes from. Right. It's not even a real fucking thing in the end of the day. But like we're trying to make it that way because the trade-off is you trade off your ethnic identity and like your family and your community ties in order to get rich. Right. And that's worked up until about 30 years ago. And now it stopped being a fucking thing. And like now we're kind of all looking around going, we need something new, which is why like I came up with communitarianism. You should check out my Substack. I write about it. It's fucking based.